Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to have yet another look at some video game history, and in the process answer the question, what exactly made Heroes of the Pacific great? First released all the way back in 2005 for the PlayStation 2, the original Xbox, and the PC, as well as going on to spawn a sequel titled Heroes Over Europe, Heroes of the Pacific was, for a long time, a fairly obscure if nevertheless well-liked game, which had a very loyal cult following. In the past few years, however, people have begun to rediscover this particular game, and in response, the game has begun to receive the reputation that it truly deserves. This is a game that deserves to be spoken of in the same vein as the Ace Combat series or Star Wars Rogue Squadron. It is an absolute gem of an arcade-era combat game, and it is so good to see the game finally get the reputation that, like I said, it deserves. But to understand why this is all the case, let's talk about what exactly made this particular title great. And the first thing that helped make Heroes of the Pacific great is that it was a masterclass in how to immerse the player into its setting. If I had to talk about any particular game that made the player feel like they were transported back to the 1940s, it would ultimately be this game that I would say did it the best. This game positively packed World War II memorabilia everywhere it possibly could. From the game's menu being made up almost exclusively of wartime posters, to the loading screens looking like they came straight out of a 1940s comic book, and a soundtrack that absolutely evokes the 1940s, and somehow manages to evoke it so well despite not really having any big band jazz music, this is a game that almost makes you feel nostalgic for the 1940s, as strange as it may seem, just because of how well it immerses the player into the experience. This even applies to the jargon and slang that is used within the game itself, though it is also of note that this is a case where the game very clearly could not be made today, as some of the language that gets frequently utilized throughout the game is the sort that will get your video demonetized if you try to show it. The developers clearly took a warts and all approach to depicting the 1940s, and you know what? That ultimately makes the game come across as more authentic and honest about how the 1940s were. And like I said, when the goal is immersion, well, a sense of honesty and authenticity does help towards the feeling of immersion, doesn't it? So as a result, this is one of the more immersive games that I have seen come out of the World War II setting. So that is one thing that helped make the game great. But another thing that I would argue helped make the game great is the sheer scale of it. Where most arcade air combat games will expect you to deal with a few dozen enemies, maybe up to something like 50 enemies at most, Heroes of the Pacific, by contrast, will throw hundreds of them at you. There are several missions within this game that include a secondary objective that reads, destroy 100 enemy aircraft. But fear not, player, for you will not be alone in this fight usually, as you'll typically have dozens of allies assisting you in taking down the enemy aircraft. In other words, these are some massive battles that you'll be seeing, which is appropriate considering these are major engagements that took place during World War II, such as the Battle of Midway or the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Keep in mind, as I've said before, this sort of thing isn't actually that common in arcade air combat games. In fact, even in flight sims in general, while it's not entirely unheard of, it is still a rare thing indeed for a game of this genre to provide battles on this sort of scale. And so that is definitely another thing that helped make the game great. But let's move on to a third thing that helped make the game great: the attention to detail as far as the gameplay is concerned. Now yes, it is of note that Heroes of the Pacific is very much an arcade air combat game and should not be mistaken for being a true flight sim. The player is given unlimited ammo, though your guns do overheat, and your secondary weapons do still need to take time to reload. That said, Heroes of the Pacific does in fact take a few cues from proper flight sims. For one thing, stalling is not a nothing burger in this game. It is something that is quite hazardous, but the additional depth comes in thanks to how torpedoes and dive bombing mechanics are actually handled within the game. With torpedoes, you have to be going under a certain speed and under a certain altitude, as well as flying at a relatively flat level. Otherwise, the torpedo will simply fail to work. Similarly, when it comes to dive bombing, you have to be going at least a certain speed and diving at least a certain steep angle, with deviations from that resulting in the bomb either failing to penetrate far enough to do significant damage, or hitting an enemy ship at enough of an angle that it bounces off. Speaking of which, it's also worth noting that the different types of aircraft vary quite significantly indeed in terms of their flight characteristics. Jets in particular, for example, are rather cantankerous as far as maneuverability is concerned, but are excellent at hit-and-run tactics. Simply fly at high speed, pick off one or two enemies, zoom away before they can properly retaliate, before turning around and doing the whole thing over again. Alternatively, fly the Catalina and use its big gun to essentially be a sniper plane, picking off enemies at extreme range. Again, this is not a proper flight sim. It does utilize some elements of flight sims, such as requiring the player to be good at torpedo bombing and dive bombing, but it is still, like I said, at the end of the day, an arcade air combat game, one that simply utilizes some elements of sims to make itself stand out a little bit more uniquely. So with the way the gameplay is handled, that is, like I said, yet another thing that helped make it great. There is one more element that I should bring up, though, that ties this all quite neatly together as far as things that helped make this game great, and that's the fact that this game was very much content heavy. The main campaign for Heroes of the Pacific spans 26 separate missions. That's not including the bonus missions, which there aren't that many of, but the fact that the main campaign is as lengthy as it is shows that, like I said, there's a lot to this game, and it does a great job of actually giving you a fair amount of variety in terms of the missions as well. Yeah, you do have several large-scale battles in the course of the campaign to go through, and those are always a blast to play, but some missions are also reconnaissance missions where you're supposed to sneak around avoiding patrols, as well as alternatively picking off the guys that might cause you trouble, or other relatively small-scale skirmish situations, such as sinking enemy submarines that are trying to refuel. My point here is that the game is more than capable of throwing something new at the player, right up to the very end. And so taking all of this into consideration, in Heroes of the Pacific we have a game that is incredibly immersive, and has zero issues putting the player into the setting. We also have a game that is more than capable of doing large-scale battles, to a degree that is rarely seen within the genre. It is also a game that offers some attention to detail that one would expect to find more from a flight sim, while still very much being an arcadey air combat game at heart. Finally, this is a game that is jam-packed with content, and has enough variety within the missions themselves to remain fresh right up to the very end. With all of this in mind, this has been Ace, and I hope you'll agree when I say that Heroes of the Pacific is great.